even then. That was on the 4th of October.
How did he look?
Horrendous. You know, even after his transplant, he obviously looked weak and ill, but this was something totally different. He could barely speak. He was very weak. He wasn't in bed, he was actually out of bed, but there was just something there, and I'll never forget, we left him and he tried to shout across the screen, you know, "Bye, darling," but he was just so weak. And whenever we left, we both had the most awful feeling. We tried to remain optimistic, but he looked so ill that we were both very, very concerned.
And it was really for the next 6 weeks that he lingered and sometimes seemed to rally and then weaken again.
It was 8 weeks in total in intensive care, and obviously statistics prove that the longer you're in intensive care, the less chance that you have coming out of it. And I knew deep down in my heart that it wasn't looking good. Even on days when I spoke to Phil and he said, yeah, he's a little bit better, he had a spoonful of porridge or some little minor detail, I struggled daily to be optimistic. I just couldn't see anything happening at all. And some of the measures which they used for George, some of the treatment was very, very radical. But, you know, I just sadly...
What about the care he received?
Second to none. Second to none. I have never... You often hear about, you know, medical staff being described as angels, but they were so professional, not only to the patient, but to the family. It was... And especially in the last 48 hours, I couldn't describe. They looked after us as much as they looked after my brother. They were just unbelievable, every single one of them. Even down to the canteen staff, you know, bringing us cups of tea, and they were just amazing. Every single person was very supportive.
Were you with him when he died?
Yes.
One of the images I have then is of the family coming out and speaking to the press. That must have been incredibly difficult at that point.
It was difficult. However, I think because of the fact he had been in intensive care for so long, I was prepared for his death. I was very strong throughout that entire period, probably stronger than anyone, possibly with the exception of my father, who's an amazing man anyway. I'm not saying that I found it easy, but I found a strength, and it got me through it.
Tell us about your dad during those last hours.
Oh, he was just... My father, during George's last hours, just remained his dignified self. He sat on George's right-hand side. I sat on George's left-hand side with Callum. And he just sat there. Every now and again I would look at him. I didn't look at Dad because, you know, it would have set me off. You know, he was watching his son really in the last hours of his life, and, you know, he spoke to him the odd occasion.
One of the images I have from when you went down to talk to the press was his last words to them. You remember when he asked them?
Yes, I think my dad asked, could you please leave us in peace now? Well, it was going to be difficult to leave us in peace. None of us could actually envisage what was ahead of us, but however, I have to say, in defence of the press, the morning before George died, on the Thursday morning, when it became apparent for sure that he wasn't going to make it, I was at the hospital first. I was there very early, spoke to the medical staff. George isn't going to make it. And I thought, right, well, my father doesn't know this yet, and he's probably en route to hospital. I went out and I sort of stormed out through the doors like somebody not quite right in the head and said, could I please speak to someone in charge? I just got blank looks. And I then said, well, could I speak to someone from Sky? And a female reporter stepped forward, and I took her to the side, and I was obviously very distraught. And I said, well, you know, George isn't going to make it, but my father doesn't know. He's on his way to the hospital now. Can I please ask you to leave him alone? And it's a scene which I'll never forget. It's a scene which I never imagined could happen with the press. I can't remember how many were there, 40, 50, 60. It was just a sea of cameras. And just at that, my father came around the corner with my other sisters, Julie, Grace, and one of their husbands, Pete. And I went over and I just shook my head, gave my dad a big hug, broke down. We had a bit of a quiet cry together, walked over towards the hospital doors, and not one camera was raised. Not one camera. In fact, cameras were put on the ground, cameras were lowered. And I remember just seeing some of the press just nodding at us, you know, that knowing look. And I was just very grateful to them, not for me, but for my father, because I knew we actually didn't think we even had 24 hours. We thought we only had a few hours at that stage.
So George passed away, and that wasn't the end of anything. That was the beginning of one hell of a week.
It was the beginning of one hell of a week. It was just the most amazing week. He had a send-off way beyond our expectations, and I'm sure way beyond his own expectations. I firmly believe that he would never have envisaged that sort of a send-off, and it's something which I doubt the world will ever see again. For a sporting hero, it was just unbelievable. It was a long, hard week. Norman worked tirelessly with all the authorities. I did what I could, but no, anything which we wanted. Not that we made many demands. I mean, by and large, we think it was quite a simple ceremony. What we wanted, we got. All our requests were met. We insisted that it was local people who took part. We wanted the people brought in from the crowd. By and large, the funeral was for the people of Northern Ireland, and we tried as far as humanly possible to keep it that way.
And the people of Northern Ireland really responded.
Oh, did they what? The people of Northern Ireland have come into their own, as far as I'm concerned, with George. Okay, we had a lot of people who travelled across for George's funeral, don't get me wrong, but the people of Northern Ireland gave us support and a strength which we didn't think we possessed, and they were absolutely amazing. And I'll never forget them, and will always be grateful to them. And they continue to give us that support.
Where did you find the strength to speak at the funeral? Because you were speaking to the whole world.
Well, the number of people who've asked me that, it's actually unbelievable, but I wasn't speaking in front of the whole world. I was speaking in front of one person, for one person. And I know I wavered a bit, but the rest of the world, I was there for him. And that's where I got the strength from.
How important was it for you to speak that day?
In my opinion, from a selfish point of view possibly, but I had to do it. I had to let him know.
It was a great tribute to George that so many very, very famous people made the effort to come to Belfast that day.
Yes, it was a great tribute. However, if I could just say that the day of George's funeral, from our perspective, wasn't for the famous people. And it's not to say that we were very delighted that they came, but George's funeral was for the ordinary people. It wasn't for the great and the good. They came and they enjoyed, but it was for the ordinary people. George was going to have a day later on where all the great and the good, which we did have in Manchester, but it was for the ordinary people, and they came in their tens of thousands.
As is so often the truth of these things, from a dark cloud emerges a silver lining, and that silver lining is the George-PT Foundation, which you and Norman have worked tirelessly to get going and move forward. What does that mean to you and the family?
The George-PT Foundation had to be, it was a chance remark by Professor Williams the day of the funeral when he saw the organisational skills which had been shown in getting it put together, just said, Norman, and you have to do something. You've got to grasp this. And we did do it, and we were nervous at the start, and it was such a mammoth task, and continued to be a mammoth task. It took us 5 months to get it up and running, legally above board. It has tested our relationship unbelievably. But when we're having a bad day, and we look at all the good reasons, and we look at all the positive things which have happened, and it's keeping George's memory, it's keeping his legacy going, and if we can do good, then we'll continue for as long as we can. It's vitally important work.
What do you hope the foundation will achieve, Barbara?
Well, our main objective is obviously to raise money for research into liver disease, very important in aspect of George and the football, which was George's passion. And I'm delighted to say that just recently we've been able to present to Professor Williams £100,000 for a very exciting breakthrough which they have discovered into liver research, and that's been what the hard work has been for.
Barbara, how do you want your brother to be remembered?
I suppose for what he wanted to be remembered for his football. Forget all the other rubbish. And I have this mission that if I can just change the mind of one cynic, that's good enough for me.
You were aware of the publicity surrounding him, not only as a footballer, but by this time his private life was really making headlines. So did you approach that with a sort of degree of trepidation?
Of course, everyone did know who George Best was. When you asked me if I approached it with a degree of trepidation, no, I didn't. However, whenever that we first made contact with George again, we arranged to meet in the Holiday Inn in I think it was Chelsea. And what happened was I was prepared for this guy who was going to be very, very full of himself, who was a guy who was regularly in the limelight. And as I say, I wasn't at all antagonistic, but I wasn't going to be impressed by George Best. And we met up in that Holiday Inn in Chelsea, and his charm immediately won me over. Because he had that way with people, he was a charmer.
Now, over the next 20 years, you built up quite a close relationship with him. Good times and bad. Tell me about some of the good times and tell me about some of the bad.
It's very hard to actually pin down what is a good time and what isn't. The fact is that we went out, Barbara, myself, Alex and George, and we had good fun. This could have been at a restaurant, it could have been in a hotel. We just seemed to bounce off each other, and with such a very uncomplicated relationship.
And how did you find him as social company?
At the start, I think that George had perhaps built up a degree of armour against people, because obviously throughout his life he'd been part of this circle where that people would have always been approaching him, and people were always trying to claim they were his best friends, etc., etc. And to a certain extent, he was abused by these people. It took some time for perhaps him to realise that our relationship was, as I say, uncomplicated. I didn't want anything out of it except for my friendship with him as a person, and I think he came to accept that.
Did being a true friend mean telling him he was drinking too much?
No, because George was his own man. And he once said to me that if he wanted a drink, he could get a drink anywhere. I wasn't going to preach to George. I wasn't going to pontificate to him. I didn't enjoy seeing him drinking. But we could only watch him drink and try to do our very best to make sure that he didn't come to any harm.
And could you give me an example of any time or incident when you were able to do that, when you prevented him coming to any harm?
I suppose An example of it might be whenever he was going through a bit of a bad spell down in Portavogie, and we had a phone call to say that he was in a particular establishment. And Barbara and I drove down there, and he had actually moved on from that one to another. And I walked into this establishment, and he was sitting there on his own with a bottle of wine. And I simply said to him, "George, don't you know this isn't doing you much good?" And he said, "Yes, mate, I know." And I said, "Shall we go?" And he says, "Okay." Now, that's about the only time that I broached the subject with him. I would say the very, very worst thing that you could do with George Best was to say to him, "George, you're not going to drink."
As you got to know him better and better, Norman, how would you sum up his qualities as a man?
He was a man of great personal charm, of great generosity, a man with a brilliant sense of humour, extremely intelligent. He was a man who had a particular skill that if he happened to meet somebody once, they would remember that for the rest of their days. And in fact, how many people have you heard say, I was a good friend of George Best, and they perhaps only met him once because he had this sheer charisma about him that made people feel they were his friend.
Can I take you to the week after George's death and the week leading up to the funeral? That was obviously a crazy, crazy time. Apart from the fact so many arrangements had to be made for a very public occasion. Tell me about your role in all of that.
Well, I think that it was the very day that George died, and the family all were upstairs in a room in the Cromwell, and we were speaking about how things were going to go, because we realised this was going to be a fairly major event. Now, I said to them all, I will act as your representative. I will help fulfill your wishes as long as I have your full permission. And the family then said, fine, away that you go. And we flew back on the Saturday, and we started our meetings with Castlereagh Borough Council on the Sunday. From the Sunday right the way through to the day of the funeral, it was just meeting after meeting with police, with the RAF, with the funeral directors, with the protocol people, with such a variety of people to ensure this was going to be carried off with the aplomb that it deserved. One thing which will stick with me was that there was a phone call to Barbara's dad's house from Peter Haynes' office, and they said to us, whatever you want, you can have. And for a person like me from a very ordinary background, being put in a position of being able to call upon resources from across the spectrum for 6 days was really, really outstanding but strange.
What's your lasting memory of the day of the funeral itself?
There's so many things. I suppose that if there's one major thing will stick with me was Barbara and how she managed to hold it all together. It was just, I suppose, another memory is going there in the cars, and what you do is to practically feel the emotion coming from the people who were standing at the side of the road. You could practically touch it. Now that's something else which will stick with me for a very long time.
So let's move on after the funeral and look back over the last 10 months, and there are certain standout events. I'll talk to you in a minute about the foundation, but talk a bit about the renaming of the airport.
At the time, the family were getting approached by many, many groups and many, many organisations trying to honour George in various ways. But as a family, the decision was taken that the most fitting way to honour George would be the renaming of the airport. And we had a look around the world, and you see the John F. Kennedy Airport, etc., 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 all tributes to great people. And I thought, what a fitting tribute for George to have the airport of his home city called after him.
And what about the day itself, when it all came together?
The actual day that the airport was renamed, we were not involved per se with much of the organisation of it. But it all ran like clockwork, with the exception of the actual unveiling itself, which there was a slight technical hiccup. But again, I felt a great pride in Barbara standing up there and speaking in front of all these people, and speaking so very, very eloquently. And that was the same day that we had a birthday party for George down in the Belfast City Hall. So all in all, that day was very hectic, obviously, but very special. Our entire existence has been altered out of all shape. We were originally planning to retire to France next year. And then, of course, we had the start of the foundation, which has now taken over our entire existence. We both work at it very, very hard for the very best of reasons. If we can hopefully perpetuate George's memory in a positive way, that in another 15 or 25 or 50 years' time, there will be kids playing football in the George Best School of Excellence here in Northern Ireland, and then maybe even out abroad, because we've got plans to maybe have a School of Excellence in South Africa too. And then align that with the possibility that through George, there may be a major breakthrough in research into alcoholism and its effect upon the liver. What more fitting tribute?